Today I want to talk just for a second about this idea of democracy and what it means. So Ron Paul talked about this a little bit on Friday and then a little bit on Monday, and today's Tuesday, the 1st of February, 2022. I'm not going to quote him because I don't want to misquote him, and I just want to sort of briefly state what I think he means by what he says, or how I interpret what he's saying, as well as how I interpret the various things that I've read about what democracy is. Okay, so in an old Encyclopedia Britannica, there were a few ways to carry out a government. So you can have a monarchy, which is one, an aristocracy, which is a group, or a republic, which is many, or a democracy, which is all, is actually what it is. Then you have ways that you carry it out. So you can carry out a monarchy by way of inheriting the position, which is considered royalty, or by electing a king or queen or emperor or whatever, a dictator, or by you can elect by a group of people can elect them, or all the people can elect them. So then you have an aristocracy. So all the people can elect them, or some of the people can elect them. So is it a democratic aristocracy, or is it a royal monarchy? Okay, so what we have here, my understanding, is that it's a democratic republic, meaning all people get to vote, and then the vote is for representatives. So democracy, when you break down the word, it's demokratos, which means demo means the common people or all the people, and then kratos means rule. So we rule how? By electing representatives. Now the representatives go to Washington or to your state capital or wherever, and they take an oath. So when they take that oath, they are bound to do only the things in the constitutions and the laws that they take an oath to. So this idea that you can elect a representative to go to Washington to give constituents what they want is flawed logic, because you can't go to Washington and make laws to make your constituents happy. That's not in the Constitution. Like the federal Constitution, normally when I say Constitution or when I talk about the laws, I'm talking about the federal level. I leave the states to all of you who are in the various states to do your own homework on that. So when people like Nancy Pelosi goes to Washington to pass laws, she's saying, well, I've got to do this for my constituents and I've got to do that for my constituents. No, you don't. What you have to do is follow the laws in the Constitution, which you took an oath to. Okay, so when she does things, or when any of them do things outside the Constitution, they're breaking the law. They're breaking their oath. And they say that they have to do that for the public good, or to make the public happy, or, because it's what the majority of people want. Well, giving the majority of people what they want, or bowing to the court of public opinion, or however you want to phrase it, is not in the Constitution. So that right there is a lie for them to try to convince you that they have to do these things outside the Constitution. So them using the idea of majority rule is not within the confines of the oath they take, because majority doesn't rule as far as them making laws outside the Constitution to pass for all the people to follow. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows them to do that. They are only supposed to make laws for the seat of government and the places that they purchase, which are for forts. So when they pass laws, they're passing laws for the people on the federal lands, the forts, and the seat of government. Okay, so when all of this stuff started, when all of this whole idea of people asking for stuff started, it started way back when spam keeps calling. When they first started putting people on federal lands. Okay, they first started putting people on federal lands to do federal works, like military officers. These military officers would get married, and their wives had no hospitals, they had no schools, they had no stores, they didn't have a lot of things that they felt that the federal government should be providing for them. So they started complaining. Now, there was back then, before the 14th Amendment, a difference between on federal lands and off federal lands. If you were on federal lands, you were just on federal lands. You didn't come off federal lands to just do whatever you want. Go to the schools, use the hospitals, because you were not, at that time, before the 14th Amendment, a state taxpayer. Okay, you were a federal taxpayer. You paid an impost, which is a tax on the things you brought onto the military post, and you paid an excise to tax on the things you took off a military post. And then while you were on the post, if you made any private income, you paid a tax on that private income. And I went over that in a video that I made a few weeks or a few days or a week ago. So you could go back and watch that one for more detail on this concept that's in the Constitution, the impost and the excise. So these wives were complaining they didn't have all these things, and they wanted those things provided for them at federal expense. So the federal government had to come up with a way to try to make money to provide these things for them. So they started coming up with all these instrumentalities, a way to make money to provide these things for the military people without taking from the public treasury. And then after the 14th Amendment, and maybe even a little bit before, the private people in the state, because the state was not federal and the federal was not state, and the people were separate. You had public people on federal lands and you had private people off federal lands. Once these officers started taking wives and bringing their wives onto the military posts to live, the complaints started coming in. They had no schools, they had no hospitals, they had no mercantile businesses, they had no place to go shopping, because they were stuck on federal lands. It was like a whole nother country. The federal forts were like a whole nother place. Even the civilians that went to work on the public lands, on the forts, lived on those lands, okay? They had no place to send their children to school. They had no hospitals. So this is where all the complaints started. And then they had to start getting creative in how they interpreted the Constitution so that they could somehow make money to provide for these things. So what they did was, like, for example, and this is not an old thing, this is more of a new thing. Like they started building these child care centers. And the child care centers, you would pay to send your child to the child care center. And the child care center was a business that would create its own money and pay for itself. So that way, there were no tax issues, there were no taken from the public coffer, and they would put these places on the military posts. So the exchanges, the commissaries, even the banks, when they were created, were supposed to be banks that were doing things for the federal people to help generate income for building the things that these people needed on the federal lands. But slowly over time, they started extending that jurisdiction to off the federal lands. And that's why private people are using federal forms. We're told that we have to, And then we're paying a tax on income that we make that we don't actually owe a tax on because we're not public people living on federal lands. Okay, so those people, when they go live on the federal lands, they're supposed to get housing, they're supposed to get medical, they're supposed to get uniforms, they're supposed to get weapons, they're supposed to get all these things, the use of the roads and all these things that we don't get. But they've started extending that stuff out into the private because they can generate revenue, which I've called revenue farming. So they're extending themselves out beyond their constitution, beyond their capacity to bring in revenue. Okay, so that's how the whole idea of, well, we got to give the public what they want, or we have to give the people what they want, or we have to, the private people are crying for welfare and they're crying for medical, and it doesn't matter what we cry for. They're not supposed to give it to us. That's not what they're there for. If we want that stuff, we need to make it ourselves. We need to have a system put in place outside the federal government, in our state only, and stop asking the federal government for this stuff and stop paying these federal taxes that go to these various systems to which these people at the Federal Reserve have their own accounts, which they take money out of, stealing our wealth. So we have this whole banking system where the bank's just stealing money instead of just going through the state and having the state do it for us. So I think what Ron Paul is saying, or my interpretation of what Ron Paul is saying and my understanding based on the various things that I've read, written down and stuff, that is that democracy is not mob rule, but it's looked at by the federal system immorally as allowing the mob to control and the mob to have the say-so in whether or not they act outside of the Constitution. So if the mob says you can act outside of the Constitution to institute medical for everyone, or institute a welfare system, or whatever else, tax everybody, then they think, or they feel like, or they use that to their advantage to create all these systems to which then they go and they skim off the top. So one of the things that I posted on my page here, my YouTube channel here, is Rebel Capitalist, I believe it was, who said that the Federal Reserve Bank has their own private accounts to which they can take profit. So they're taking, you're paying $10, they're taking $5 and giving you $5 back. That doesn't sound right. Why don't we just have our states do this for us ourselves, or just do it for ourselves? So we could save ourselves a lot of money, because once you start paying this stuff in metals, eventually you will have to, if you want to actually own your own stuff, you're going to have to start paying in metals. If you want to actually own the things that you work for and purchase, including your insurance, then you're going to have to use metals, and you're going to have to take responsibility. And you don't want to give someone half an ounce, or give somebody an ounce, and you only get half an ounce worth of return. Okay, so in my opinion, he's saying democracy, they're using democracy to their advantage to allow the mob to rule. And then on top of that, they're conditioning people to believe that they have the power to do it, or that they need it, or that it has to happen, or we have to do this, or they're getting tired of us not getting the V's, or they're getting tired of us not following the mandates, when we have to do this, like they have the power to say how we live our lives, and they don't. Because if you actually read the Constitution, it says the representatives of the federal lands work for the United States of America, which is the private people. So the public people work for the private people. They are employees of us, the private. The public always works for the private. That's what a representative democracy is. not this mob rule, not this they can use the system to gain advantage and gain money and skim off the top, because really the Federal Reserve is a quasi-public private corporation. So some things to think about, and my opinion of what democracy is and what it isn't. And it's that you have a voice, but you have a voice in who's elected to go carry out the Constitution, not when they get there what they can do. And they can do basically whatever they want, as long as they can convince us that that's what the majority wants, which is not true at all. Okay, so if you have any questions or comments, post them down below, and like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all in the next video.